Hello, bruv. Since it is All Hallows Eve, and I've always wanted to read this book after Patchy's seen it at the library, I figured I would read a little bit. All Hallows Eve by Charles Williams. I believe it was written in 1945. Introduction by T.S. Eliot. 1948. The New Life, The Beatles, Clerk Simon, The Dream, The Hall My by Holborn. Let's get right to this bullshit. Chapter 1, The New Life. She was standing on Westminster Bridge. It was twilight, but the city was no longer dark. The street lamps along the embankment were still dimmed, but in the buildings shutters and blinds and curtains had been removed or left undrawn, and the lights were coming out there like the first faint stars above. Those lights were the peace. It was true that formal peace was not yet in being. All that had happened was that fighting had ceased. The enemy, as enemy, no longer existed, and one more crisis of agony was done. Labor, intelligence, patience, much need for these, and much certainty of boredom and suffering and misery, but no longer the sick vigils and daily despair. Lester Furnival stood and looked at the city while the twilight deepened. The devastated areas were hidden. Much was to be done, but could be. In the distance she could hear an occasional plane. Its sound gave her a greater sense of relief than the silence. It was precisely not dangerous. It promised a truer safety than all the squadrons of fighters and bombers had held. Something was ended, and those remote engines told her so. The moon was not yet risen. The river was dark below. She put her hand on the parapet and looked at it. It should make no more bandages if she could help it. It was not a bad hand, though it was neither so clean nor so smooth as it had been years ago before the war. It was 25 now, and to her that seemed a great age. She went on looking at it for a long while, in the silence and the peace, until it occurred to her that the silence was very prolonged, except for that recurrent solitary plane. No one, all the time she had been standing there, had crossed the bridge. No voice, no step, no car had sounded in the deepening night. She took her hand off the wall and turned. The bridge was as empty as the river. No vehicles or pedestrians here, no craft there. In all that city she might have been the only living thing. She had been so impressed by the sense of security and peace while she had been looking down at the river that only now did she begin to try and remember why she was there on the bridge. There was a confused sense in her mind that she was on her way somewhere. She was either going to or was on her way somewhere. She was either going to or coming from her own flat. Sorry, I repeated, bruv. It might have been to meet Richard, though she had an idea that Dickie, or someone with Dickie, had told her not to come. But she could not think of anyone except Richard, who was at all likely to do so, and anyhow, she knew she had been determined to come. It was all mixed up with that crash which had put everything out of her head, and as she lifted her eyes, she saw beyond the houses and the abbey the cause of the crash, the plane lying half in the river and half on the embankment. She looked at it with a sense of its importance to her, but she could not tell why it should seem so important. Her only immediate concern with it seemed to be that it might have blocked the direct road home to her flat, which lay beyond Millbank and was where Richard was or would be, and her own chief affairs. She thought of it with pleasure. It was reasonably new and fresh, and they had been lucky to get it when Richard and she had been married yesterday. At least, yesterday? Well, not yesterday, but not very much longer than yesterday. Only the other day. It had been the other day. The word for a moment worried her. It had been indeed another, a separate day. She felt as if she had almost lost her memory of it, yet she knew she had not. She had been married, and to Richard. The plain, in the thickening darkness, was now but a thicker darkness, indistinguishable only because her eyes were still fixed on it. If she moved, she would lose it. If she lost it, she would be left in the midst of this lull. She knew the sudden London lulls were well enough, but this lull was lasting absurdly long. All the lulls she had ever known were not as deep as this, in which there seemed no movement at all. If the gentle agitation of the now visible stars were less than movement, or the steady flow of the river beneath her, she had at least seen that flowing, or had she? Was that also still? She was alone with this night in the city, a night of peace and lights and stars and of bridges and streets she knew, but all in a silence she did not know, so that if she yielded to the silence she would not know those other things, and the whole place would be different and dreadful. She stood upon the parapet against which she had been leaning, and shook herself impatiently. I'm moithering. The fuck is moithering? I'm moithering, she said in a word that she had picked up from a Red Cross companion, and took a step forward. If she could not get directly along Millbank, she must go round. Fortunately, the city was at least partially lit now. The lights in the houses shone out, and by them she could see more clearly than in the bad old days. Also, she could see into them, and somewhere in her there was a small desire to see someone. A woman reading, children playing, a man listening to the wireless, something of that humanity which must be near, but of which on that lonely bridge she could feel nothing. She turned her face towards Westminster and began to walk. She had hardly taken a dozen steps when she stopped. In the first moment she thought it was only the echo of her own steps, and she heard, but immediately she knew it was not. Someone else at last was there. Someone else was coming quickly. Her heart leaped and subsided. The sound at once delighted and frightened her, but she grew angry with this sort of dalliance, this over-consciousness of sensation. It was more like Richard than herself. Richard could be aware of sensation so and yet take it in its stride. It was apt to distract her. She had admired him for it, and still did, only now she was a little envious and irritated. She blamed Richard for her own incapacity. She had paused, and before she could go on, she knew the steps. They were his. 6 months of marriage had not dulled the recognition. She knew the true time of it at once. It was Richard himself coming. She went quickly on. In a few moments she saw him. Her eyes as well as her ears recognized him. Her relief increased her anger. Why had he let her in for this inconvenience? Had they arranged to meet? If so, why had he not been there? Why had she been kept waiting? And what had she been doing while she had been kept? The lingering lack of memory drove her on and increased her irritation. He was coming. His fair, bare head shone dark gold under her father's street lamp. Under the mirror they came face to face. He stopped dead as he saw her, and his face went white. Then he sprang towards her. She threw up her hands as if to keep him off. She said with a coldness against her deeper will, but she could not help it. Where have you been? What have you been doing? I've been waiting, he said. How did you get out? What do you mean, waiting? The question startled her. She stared at him. His own gaze was troubled and almost inimical. There was something in him which scared her more. She wondered if she were going to faint, for he seemed almost to float before her in the air, and to be far away. She said, What do you mean? Where are you going? Richard. For he was going, in another sense, her hands still raised in that repelling gesture. She saw him move backwards, uncertainly, out of the range of that dimmed light. She went after him. He should not evade her. She was almost up to him, and she saw him throw out his hands towards her. She caught them. She knew she caught them, for she could see them in her own, but she could not feel them. They were terrifying. He was terrifying. She brought her hands against her breast, and they grew fixed there. As wide-eyed with anger and fear, she watched him disappearing before her. As if he were a ghost, he faded, and with him faded all the pleasant human sounds, feet, voices, bells, engines, wheels, which now she knew that, while she had talked to him, she had again clearly heard. He had gone. All was silent. She choked on his name. It did not recall him. He had vanished, and she stood once more alone. She could not tell how long she stood there, shocked and impotent to move. Her fear was at first part of her rage, but presently it separated itself and was cold in her and became a single definite thought. When at last she could move, could step again to the parapet and lean against it and rest her hands on it, the thought possessed her with its desolation. It dominated everything, anger and perplexity and the silence. It was, in a word, dead, she thought, dead. He could not otherwise have gone. Never in all their quarrels had he gone, or she, that certainly had allowed them a license they dared not otherwise have risked. She began to cry, unusually, helplessly, stupidly. She felt the tears on her face and peered at the parapet for her handbag and handkerchief. Since now she could not, oh, despair, borrow this, as with her most blasting taunt she had sometimes done. It was not on the parapet. She took a step or two away, brushed with her hand the tears from her eyes, and looked about the pavement. It was not on the pavement. She was crying in the street, and she had neither handkerchief nor powder. This was what happened when Richard was gone, was dead. He must be dead. How else could he be gone? How else could she be there? And so, dead, and she had done it once often, too often. Dead, and this had been their parting. Dead, her misery swamped her penitence. They had told each other it made no difference, and now it had made this. They had reassured each other in their reconciliations, for though they had been fools and quick-tempered, high egotists and bitter of tongue, they had been much in love, and they had been fighting their way. But she felt her own inner mind had always foreboded this, dead, separate, forever separate. It did not, in that separation, much matter who was dead. If it had been she, on that instant she knew it. The word still meant to her so much, only this separation, that the knowledge did not at first surprise her. One of them was, she was, very well she was, but then she was. On that apparent bridge, beneath those apparent stars, she stood up and knew it. Her tears stopped and dried. She felt the stiffness. Sorry, my eye was itching. And the stains on her apparent flesh. She did not now doubt the fact and was still not surprised. She remembered what had happened, herself setting out to meet Evelyn at the tube, and instead coming across her just over there, and their stopping. And then the sudden loud noise, the shrieks, the violent pain, the plane had crashed on them. She had then, or very soon after, before what she was, become what she now was. She was no longer crying. Her misery had frozen. The separation she endured was deeper than she even had believed. She had seen Richard for the last time, for now she herself was away beyond him. She was entirely cut off. She was dead. It was now a more foreign word than it had ever been, and it meant this. She could perhaps, if it was he who had been dead, have gone to him, and now she could not. She could never get back to him, and he would never come to her. He could not. She had thrown him away. It was all quite proper, quite inevitable. She had pushed him away, and there was an end to Richard. But there was no end to her. Never in her life had she contemplated so final an end which was no end. All change had carried on some kind of memory which was encouragement. She had not always supposed it to be so. She had told herself when she left school, when she was married, that she was facing a new life. But she had, on the whole, been fortunate in her passage, and some pleasantness in her past had always offered her a promise in the future. This, however, was quite new life. Her good fortune has preserved her from any experience of that state, which is almost adequately called death in life. Her heart had not fallen ever, ever, through an unfathomed emptiness, supported only on the fluttering wings of everyday life, and not even realizing that it was so supported. She was a quite ordinary and rather lucky girl, and she was dead. My God, my hand is aching. I can't continue. At least not in this capacity, bruv. Let's grab a book or something to balance this. Hold it, bruv. You can do it. Phew. My hands finally get some relief. Only the city lay silently around her. Only the river flowed below, and then the stars flickered above, and in the houses lights shone. It occurred to her presently to wonder vaguely, as in hopeless affliction men do wonder why the lights were shining. If the city were as empty as it seemed, if there was no companion anywhere, why the lights? She gazed at them, and the wonder flickered and went away, and after a while returned, and presently went away again, and so on for a long time. She remained standing there, for though she had been a reasonably intelligent and forceful creature, she had never, in fact, had to display any initiative, much less such initiative as was needed here. She had never much thought about death. She had never prepared for it. She had never related anything to it. She had nothing whatever to do with it, or therefore in it, as it seemed to have nothing to offer her except the wide prospect of London. She remained helpless. She knew it was a wide prospect, for after she had remained for a great while in the dark, it had grown slowly light again. A kind of pale October day had dawned, and the lights in the apparent houses had gone out, and then it had once more grown dark, and they had shone, and so on, 20 or 30 times. There had been no sun. During the day she saw the river and the city. During the night, the stars. Nothing else. Why at last she began to move, she could not have said. She was not hungry or thirsty or cold or tired. Well, perhaps a little cold and tired, but only a little, and certainly not hungry or thirsty. But if Richard, in this new sense, were not coming, it presently seemed to her useless to wait. But besides Richard, the only thing in which she had been interested had been the apparatus of mortal life, not people. She had not cared for people particularly, even perhaps Evelyn. She was sincerely used to Evelyn, whom she had known at school and since, but apart from Evelyn, not people. Only the things they used and lived in, houses, dresses, furniture, gadgets of all kinds. That was what she had liked, and if she wanted it now, that was what she had got. She did not, of course, know this, and she could not know that it was the sincerity of her interest that procured her this relaxation in the void. If Richard had died, this would have remained vivid to her. Since she was dead, it remained also, though not stripped of all forms of men and women, particularly vivid. She began to walk. It did not much matter which way. Her first conscious movement, and even that was hardly a movement of volition, was to look over her shoulder in the seeming daylight to see if the plain were there. It was, though dimmer and smaller, as if it were fading. Would the whole city gradually fade and leave her to emptiness, or would she too fade? She did not really attempt to grapple with the problem of her seeming body. Death did not offer her problems of that sort. Her body and life had never been a problem. She had accepted it, inconveniences and all, as a thing that simply was. Her pride, and she had a good deal of pride, especially sexual, had kept her from commitments, except with Richard. It was her willingness to commit herself with Richard that made her believe she, as she called it, loved Richard, though in her had bad moments she definitely wished Richard in that sense to love her more than she loved him. But her bad moments were not many. She really did want, need, and so far love Richard. Her lack of longing and despair and self-blame were sincere enough, and they did not surprise her. It had been plain, honest passion, and plain, honest passion it remained. But now the passion more and more took the form of one thought. She had done it again. She had done it once too often, and this was the unalterable result. She began to walk. She went up northward. That was instinct. She at least knew that part of London. Up from the bridge, up Whitehall, no one. Into Trafalgar Square. Trafalgar Square. I'm going to botch that the entire time here, bruv. No one. In the shops, in the offices, no one. They were all full and furnished with everything but man. At moments as she walked, a horrible fancy took her. Let's start again there, bro. At moments as she walked, a horrible fancy took her that those at which she was not. This is awful writing. At the moment, looking, were completely empty, that everything was but a facade with nothing at all behind it. That if she had walked straight through one of those shops, she would come out into entire nothing. It was a creeping sensation of the void. She herself could not have put it into words, but there the suspicion was. She came to the bottom of Charing Cross Road, Charing, and began to go up it. In front of her, she saw the curtains of the brick that hid the entrances to Leicester Square Tube Station. By one of them, on the opposite side of the road, someone was standing. She was still not conscious of any shock or surprise, or of fear or even relief. Her emotions were not in action. There had been no one. There was now someone. It was not Richard. It was another young woman. She crossed the road towards the unknown. It seemed the thing to do. Unknown. Not unknown. It was, and now she did feel a faint surprise. It was Evelyn. In the sudden recollection of having arranged to meet Evelyn there, she almost forgot that she was dead. But then she remembered that their actual meeting had been accidental. They had both happened to be on their way to their appointed place. As she remembered, she felt a sudden renewal of the pain and of the oblivion. It did not remain. There was nothing to do but go on. She went on. The figure of Evelyn moved and came towards her. The sound of her heels was at first hideously loud on the pavement as she came, but after a step or two it dwindled to almost nothing. Lester hardly noticed the noise at the time or its diminution. Her sense was in her eyes. She absorbed the approaching form as it neared her with a growing intensity which caused her almost to forget Richard. The second best was now the only best. As they drew together, she would not find anything to say beyond what she had said 100 times, dull and careless. "Oh, hello, Evelyn." The sound of the words scared her, but much more the immediate and intolerable anxiety about the reply. Would it come? It did come. The shape of her friend said in a shaking voice, "Oh, hello, Lester." That sounds like Ezra Pound reading the Canos. They stopped and looked at each other. Lester could not find it possible to speak of their present state. Evelyn stood before her, a little shorter than she, with her rather pinched face and quick, glancing black eyes. Her black hair was covered by a small green hat. She wore a green coat, and her hands were fidgeting with each other. Lester saw at once that she also was without a handbag. This lack of what, for both of them, was almost, if not quite, part of their very dress. How many pages? This frickin' first chapter, dude. It goes on forever. Page 23. Something without which they were never seen in public. This loss of handkerchief, compact, keys, money, letters left them peculiarly desolate. They had nothing but themselves. I think this video will only record 30 minutes too. But themselves and what they wore, no property, no convenience. Lester felt nervous of the loss of her dress itself. She clutched it defensively. Without her handbag, she was doubly forlorn in this empty city. But Evelyn was there, and Evelyn was something. They could, each of them, whatever was to happen, meet it with something human close by. Poor, deserted vagrants as they were, they could at least be companions in their wanderings. She said, "So you're here," and felt a little cheered. Perhaps soon she would be able to utter the word death. Lester had no lack of courage. She had always been willing, as it is called, to face facts. Indeed, her chief danger had been that, in a life with no particular crisis and no particular meaning, she would invent for herself facts to face. She had the common vague idea of her age that if your sexual life was all right, you were all right, bruv. And she had the common vague idea of all ages that if you and your sexual life were not all right, it was probably someone else's fault. Perhaps undeliberate, but still their fault. Her irritation with her husband had been much more the result of power-seeking material than mere fretfulness. Her courage and power when she saw Evelyn stirred, she half prepared a part for them to play. Frankness, exploration, daring. Oh, if it could but have been with Richard. Evelyn was speaking, her quick and yet inaccurate voice rippled in words and slurred them. She said, "You have been a long time. I quite thought you wouldn't be coming. I've been waiting. You can't think how long. Let's go into the park and sit down." Lester was about to answer when she was appalled by the mere flat ordinariness of the words. She had been gripping to herself so long her final loss of Richard that she had gripped also the new state in which they were. This talk of sitting down in the park came over her like a nightmare, with a nightmare's horror of unreality become actual. She saw before her the entrance to the station, and she remembered they had meant to go somewhere by tube. She began with an equal idiocy to say, "But we weren't we?" Let me say that again, bro. She began with an equal idiocy to say, "But weren't we?" When Evelyn gripped her arm. Lester disliked being held. She disliked Evelyn holding her. Now she disliked it more than ever. Her flesh shrank. Her eyes were on the station entrance, and the repulsion of her flesh spread. There was the entrance. They had meant to go, yes, but there could not now be any tube below, or it would be as empty as the street. A medieval would have feared other things in such a moment, the way perhaps to the Città Dolente, or the people of it. Smooth or hairy, tusked or clawed, malicious or lustful, creeping and clambering up from the lower depths. She did not think of that, but she did think of the spaces and what might fill them. What but the dead? Perhaps in a flash she saw them. Perhaps there the people, the dead people of this empty city were. Perhaps that was where the whole population had been lying, waiting for her too, the entrance. Waiting and all below the entrance. There were things her courage could not face. Evelyn's clutch on her arm was light out of all proportion to the fear in Evelyn's eyes, but in her own fear she yielded to it. She allowed herself to be led away. They went into the park. They found a seat. They sat down. Evelyn had begun to talk, and now she went on. Lester had always known Evelyn talked a good deal, but she had never listened to more than she chose. Now she could not help listening, and she had never before heard Evelyn gabble like this. The voice was small and thin, as it usually was, but it was speedier and much more continuous. It was like a river. No, it was like something thrown about on a river, twisted and tossed. It had no pressure, it had no weight, but it went on. She was saying that we wouldn't go to see it today, after all. I mean, there aren't many people about, and I do hate an empty theater, don't you? Even a cinema, it always seems different. I hate not being with people. Should we go and see Betty? I know you don't much care for Betty or her mother. I don't like her mother myself, though, of course, with Betty she must have had a very difficult time. I wish I could have done more for her. But I did try. I'm really very fond of Betty, and I always said that there was some simple explanation for that odd business with the little German refugee a year or two ago. Naturally, I never said anything to her about it, because she's almost morbidly shy, isn't she? I did hear that the painter had been there several times lately. What's his name? Drayton? He's a friend of your husband, isn't he? But I shouldn't think he. Lester said if she said. She was not certain, but she seemed to say, "Be quiet, Evelyn." The voice stopped. Lester knew that she had stopped it. She could not herself say more. The stillness of the city was immediately present again, and for a moment she almost regretted her words. But of the two she knew, she preferred the inimical stillness to that Insensate? Insensate babble? Death as death was preferable to death mimicking a foolish life. That's a pretty good line. Death as death was preferable to death mimicking a foolish life. Let's put a key on that, bruv. That's pretty good. Put a key inside there. Or maybe we should put something else. An old Revco drug center form. She sat almost defiantly silent. They both sat silent. Presently, Lester heard by her side a small and curious noise. She looked round. Evelyn was sitting there crying, as Lester had cried, the tears running down her face, and the small noise came from her mouth. She was shaking all over, and her teeth were knocking together. That was the noise. Lester looked at her. Once she would have been impatient or sympathetic. She felt that, even now, she might be either. But in fact, she was neither. There was Evelyn crying and chattering. There was Evelyn crying and chattering. It was not a matter of what that seemed relevant. She looked away again. They went on sitting. The first shadow of another night was in the sky. There was never any sun, so it could not sink. There was a moon, but a moon of some difference, for it gave no light. It was large and bright and cold, and it hung in the sky, but there was no moonlight on the ground. The lights in the houses would come on and then go out. It was certainly growing darker. By her side, the chattering went on. The crying became more full of despair. Lester dimly remembered that she would once have been as irritated by it as all, but the truly compassionate always are, by misery. Now she was not. She said nothing. She did nothing. She could not help being aware of Evelyn, and a slow recollection of her past with Evelyn forced itself on her mind. She knew she had never really liked Evelyn, but Evelyn had been a habit, almost a drug, with which she filled spare hours. Evelyn usually did what Lester wanted. She would talk gossip, which Lester did not quite like to talk, but did rather like to hear talked, because she could listen to it while despising... Wrong page, bruv. Despising it. You son of a bitch. She kept Lester up to date in all her Who is Lester? Is Lester the dead person? Or is it Evelyn? She kept Lester up to date in all of her less decent curiosities. She came because she was invited and stayed because she was needed. They went out together because it suited them. They had been going out that afternoon because it suited them, and now they were dead. Wait, they're both dead? And sitting in the park because it had suited someone or something else, someone who had let a weakness into the plane or had not been able to manage the plane, or perhaps the city of facades which in a mere magnetic emptiness had drawn them to be there, just there. Still motionlessly gazing across the darkening park, Lester thought again of Richard. If Richard had been in distress by her side,